father of the assassinated Prime Minister Bhutto, called for a summit for all Arab and Muslim world. And there made the links between the Muslim world undermining the alliance with Western world itself. Because there was an anger amongst the ruling elite in Pakistan that the West did not stand with Pakistan during the East Pakistan operation. But I do not think that they understood that nobody in the West could have stood by them, because the West also had a public opinion, and the West had a free press, where people did see what had happened, and their governments could not very brazenly stand with a military that was waging a war on ethnic grounds with no political justification at all. But then we had a period in the 80s, and I want to jump right into it, where we had a dictator called Zia-ul Haq. I'm sure you never heard of him, but we know him very well. It was a time when we mended our fences with the US, and it was a time that Zia-ul Haq needed the US as much as the US or Western powers needed him. Because the fight against the Soviet bloc was being fought in Afghanistan, and people and mujahideen or jihadis or soldiers of Islam were being prepared on Pakistani soil. So what we are suffering today is overwhelmingly our own fault, but it is also the wrong policies of the international community. It is also the leaders of the international community who are unable in many ways to see that if you let that genie out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back. What did we see? That in that part of our lives, we never had a Wahhabi Islam, a very rigid kind of Islam. But we began to see that first the laws would change, then the policies would change, and then we began to see that people were being changed, so that the head of every institution was not a head who was clean-shaven, not a woman, but a person who actually either believed in rigid Islam or had to pretend to believe in rigid Islam. We had, for the first time, punishments like stoning to death. We never had these punishments. It was alien to our culture. And that is why these punishments were never really executed, because the leaders and the rulers who even promulgated these laws knew that this was not our culture. But they kept it in the statute book to intimidate people. And Islam, and the misuse of Islam, I should say, was done in a way that it operated as fear, intimidation, and terror amongst the people of Pakistan. For the first time, we had punishments like amputation in hand and feet, which had never happened before. For the first time, we had a law where the evidence of women was simply not acceptable in cases of the highest penalty, like stoning to death or amputation of hand, despite the fact that even in cases of rape, women's evidence for the most severe penalty was not accepted, though she may be a victim. Not only women, non-Muslims was not accepted. So basically, a Muslim could have gone into a Christian house, stolen in front of everyone, and got away with a lighter punishment because there were no Muslim witnesses. And therefore for the first time, we saw that the whole question of interest, banking interest, came up. But Zia-ul Haq was a very strategic dictator. So he turned around the interest problem into what we call now in Pakistan loss and profit in the banking system, which really is interest. We simply call it profit and loss. And subsequently, again, that was also challenged, but I'll come to that later. And for the first time, there were laws which said that in case of future financial obligations and transactions, the evidence will be that of two men, or one man and two women. thereby reducing the value of women altogether. There were policies in colleges and schools where women had to cover their heads, had to wear the dupattas. While I was going to college, and our ambassador is here who also went to college with me, she would bear the fact that we didn't care whether we had a dupatta or not. Nobody told us. We went as we pleased, whether we had it or we didn't have it, whether we wore national dress, whether we wore a trouser. As long as we dressed neatly and appropriately, there was no question of reprimanding us for the manner of dressing while we were in college. For the first time, we had laws of blasphemy. And the laws of blasphemy were made in a way that were so vague. For example, there is a law, and still is in our country, which says that if you defile the name of the Holy Prophet, directly or indirectly, through innuendos, gestures, or otherwise, you shall be given death penalty, and it is mandatory death penalty. So anyone who is accused of blasphemy is as good as dead once they are accused of it. We still have nobody, and our judges tell us with great pride, anyone where death penalty has been executed, but we have had hundreds of cases where people have been convicted or have been killed before being convicted, or have been convicted and then made to escape from jail. And we have also had cases where a crowd has come, accused people of blasphemy, dragged the person, and the person has died in front of their family, and the family kept saying, he didn't do anything, he didn't do anything. And it was later that everybody then found out that the man actually had not committed any blasphemy. But worse still is that there is not a single person who has killed in the name of blasphemy who has been brought to justice. But several who have been killed, falsely accused, later on proved of having committed the so-called blasphemy. We also have another law in our country which really wrecked our criminal legal system. And the law is called qisas and diyat, which means that if I go and murder anyone, I can be forgiven by the victim's family. Which means that if I'm powerful, I have a right to murder, pressurize the victim's family, and pressurize him to accepting money. And this culture of forgiveness hasn't stopped with murder. Now as a lawyer, when I work, I get policemen saying to me, this woman has forgiven when she was raped. But I said, it doesn't say in the law that she can forgive. But if you can forgive in murder, you will say, surely you can forgive in rape. So there is all this forgive and forget policy, which means, in other words, impunity for the powerful and victimization, no end for those who are powerless. We saw that official attires changed, that judges' clothes changed. From a suit, they were wearing ajkan. And women lawyers' dress code changed. We also saw that people were put in position, particularly in the education department. And so education department was completely hijacked by those in the extreme right. Not only education, but media was extremely hijacked. So those voices that were left, who were criticizing the Islamization, these voices were not being raised to the level that anybody could have heard them. And I have to say that it was in this particular, very oppressive period, it was not only oppressive in terms of Islamization, even politically it was very oppressive. For example, in 1984, when I was in jail, there was a woman with me in jail, and her 14-year-old brother was being executed in the next barrack. Just 14-year-old. And the number of children that were executed, those in that period of time, was not something that the West saw. But what was being fed to the public in the West is that here is Pakistan that is very valiantly fighting the war against the Soviet Union. But what was not being told was that who are fighting this war, what is the thinking and the ideology of the people who are fighting the war. Their ideology was anti-women. Their ideology was hate of infidels.